Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The night my father turned 70, I made his favorite pie and almost got disowned before dessert. It was lemon meringue, his tradition for as long as I could remember, and I'd made it from scratch like I always did, down to the hand-pressed crust and the glossy peaks toasted just the way he liked them. We were sitting in a steakhouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent, which was ironic since I didn't technically pay rent. I lived in the guest house behind my parents' home, and I paid in chores, errands, and emotional labor. The table was long and polished, set for 8, with crystal glasses and flickering candles, and not one of us truly wanted to be there except maybe my mother, who always saw these things as opportunities to keep pretending we were still a family that worked. My brother Evan was already on his 3rd whiskey before the appetizers even came. He was telling some loud story about closing a deal he probably didn't even understand, and Uncle Donnie kept interrupting with snorts that turned into coughs, turning heads from nearby tables. I sat quietly, nodding when required, smiling through the kind of tightness in your jaw that feels like holding back a scream. My father hadn't even looked at me directly until the steak was finished, the wine bottles half empty, and the waiter brought out the pie on a silver tray like it was some goddamn offering. He stood slowly, steadying himself on the back of his chair, tapping his knife against his glass like this was a wedding or something. Everyone raised theirs politely. I didn't. I already knew something was coming. I felt it in the way he smiled, like he was winding up for something sharp. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he said, his voice still strong, still filled with that old-school charm that could manipulate a room like a magician flicking his wrist. 70 years. Not bad, right? Everyone chuckled because they were supposed to. "I built a life I'm proud of," he continued, looking down the table like a general surveying his troops. "A good business, a good home. A son who carries my name and legacy." He raised his glass toward Evan, who nodded like a smug prince. "And a daughter," he added after a pause, his voice hardening just slightly. "Still living in the guest house, still finding herself. Maggie, you've been living in that house too long for someone your age. You'll never amount to anything if you don't learn to stand on your own. Maybe it's time you left." The words didn't register right away. There was a beat where my ears started ringing like someone had slammed a car door too close to my head. I looked around the table, waiting for anyone to say something. My brother just grinned into his drink like he'd heard it before. My mother stared down at her plate with the kind of practiced blankness she used during arguments, the same one I saw when she folded towels with trembling hands. No one said a damn thing. The lemon meringue pie sat in front of him, untouched. The pie I made by hand. The pie I'd nearly burned my wrist pulling out of the oven that morning. The pie I brought because I thought maybe, just maybe, it still meant something. I didn't cry. Not there. I stood up, slowly, methodically, pushed my chair back, and said, "Happy birthday." That was it. I didn't make a scene. I didn't yell or flip the table or even toss the pie in his lap, though later I wished I had. I just left. Walked right past the hostess stand, past the valet, into the night air that felt too warm for October. My hands were shaking by the time I reached my car. I didn't go home to cry. I went home to pack. I didn't own much, which made it easier. Clothes, 2 books I hadn't returned to the library, a few binders from work. I didn't bother with the little framed photo of me and my mom from my high school graduation. It had been cracked in one corner for years anyway. I left my house key on the kitchen table with a sticky note that said, "You'll be just fine without me, right?" I don't even remember writing it, but I remember how my hand trembled just enough to smudge the ink. I turned off the lights one last time and locked the front door from the inside, which I knew they wouldn't like. They'd have to climb through a window or call a locksmith. A petty part of me smiled at that thought. I slept in my car that night behind a gas station off Route 29, parked between 2 semi-trucks that ran their engines all night like lullabies for the damned. I barely slept. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the radio buzz in and out, wondering what the hell I was going to do next. I had less than $400 in my account, no backup plan, and no one I could really call, not because they weren't out there, but because I was too tired to explain. Funny thing is, I didn't even cry until morning. And it wasn't a sobbing, dramatic cry. It was just this one tear that slid down my cheek like my body needed to let out something to make room for what came next. And what came next wasn't silence. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even the sound of my name in a worried voicemail. By the time the sun rose, the house was already starting to fall apart. The next morning, before the sun had even burned off the early October fog, the first call came through on the landline that nobody ever picked up anymore. It rang and rang, then started again, almost like it was angry, like it knew something was wrong in the house, and was trying to wake the people inside from a sleep they'd been in for far too long. No one moved at first, maybe assuming it was a robocall or a mistake, but then the kitchen phone rang too, then Evan's cell, then Carol's old cordless, the one she kept beside the fridge in case she ever needed to call the neighbors. But the calls weren't spam or sales or old friends. They were from people who suddenly needed answers, and no one left inside the house had a damn clue how to give them. Carol was the first to pick up. Her voice cracked before she even said hello, and she could barely get through the sentence before she began to realize something was off. The bank wanted to confirm a withdrawal that hadn't gone through. The electric company had flagged an unpaid bill from 2 months ago. The property tax office left a voicemail saying the deadline had passed with no payment and no contact. And before long, the water shut off entirely. Evan stumbled into the kitchen, barefoot, rubbing his eyes like a teenager woken up on a Sunday morning. He opened the faucet, turned both knobs, cursed under his breath, and shouted into the hallway, asking why there was no damn water. Carol didn't answer because by then she was already going through the stack of mail on the kitchen counter, flipping through unopened envelopes addressed to M. Harrison, the ones she had gotten used to leaving untouched because Maggie always handled that sort of thing. Except Maggie wasn't there anymore, and suddenly every letter felt like a fuse waiting to blow. Richard came downstairs last. He walked like he was in a dream, annoyed by the noise, confused by the tension in the air, and completely unaware that the tight strings holding their lives together had already snapped sometime between the birthday toast and sunrise. He sat at the table, barked something about needing coffee, and waited like he always did for things to appear in front of him without having to ask twice. When Carol told him the water was off, he raised an eyebrow and said, "Just call the city and sort it." When Evan said he couldn't access the company payroll, Richard replied, "Try again, it's just numbers and passwords." But when they finally admitted that none of them had any idea how to pay the bills, run the business, or even log into the online accounts, something in Richard's face shifted, not panic, not humility, just a cold confusion. Like the reality he'd built didn't make sense anymore without the piece he'd so carelessly shoved out the door. It turns out Maggie had been running everything, not just the day-to-day, not just the errands or the grocery lists or the company calendar. She handled payroll for 15 employees. She submitted the company's quarterly tax filings. She scheduled subcontractors and confirmed inspection dates. She processed invoices, flagged fraudulent activity, and built a complex, color-coded system that had kept the entire operation running without a hitch for nearly 6 years. Evan's assistant eventually found Maggie's binder, the big blue one with sticky tabs and handwritten notes in the margins, but couldn't make heads or tails of it. The system Maggie had built wasn't just efficient, it was protective. Every password was coded, every shortcut hidden behind a puzzle only she could solve. It wasn't just organization, it was armor. And now, without her, everything was falling apart like a row of dominoes tipped with a flick of her walking away. By mid-afternoon, Uncle Donnie had called twice, wondering why his paycheck hadn't hit his account. 3 clients left messages about missing contracts. The bookkeeper Maggie had hired part-time tried to reach her cell but got nothing but voicemail. And still, Richard refused to call her himself. He sat in his chair like a king betrayed, arms crossed, nostrils flaring, muttering about how ungrateful she was and how she'd always been dramatic. How hard could it be? He snapped when Evan dropped a stack of unpaid invoices onto the dining table. It's just bills. It's numbers, for God's sake. He said it like he was lecturing a child, but the tremble in his voice gave away the cracks forming beneath the surface. And that was when Carol said it, barely louder than a whisper. Did Maggie handle all this? The room fell silent, not because the answer wasn't obvious, but because admitting it out loud felt like confessing to a crime. They had taken her for granted, used her as the silent scaffolding holding everything up while pretending she was the one leaning on them. And in that silence, as the late afternoon sun filtered in through the dusty blinds and the air grew stale with tension and unsaid things, Carol picked up her phone. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even leave a message. She just hit the call button, let the phone ring once, twice, then switched to voicemail and held it there. I heard that message later, and all it was breathing. Just her breathing, like maybe the only thing she could offer was proof she was still alive, still aware of what had happened, still mourning the hole I'd left in the house like an unplugged vein. And they kept going like that for hours, checking accounts that no longer opened, calling vendors who had already stopped answering, pretending like this was just a temporary hiccup and not a full-blown collapse. And through it all, my name wasn't spoken out loud, not once. Maybe they thought not saying it would give them power, would somehow undo the damage. But the truth was, by then it was too late. And yes, I heard the rumor later, the one Evan told someone at the bar. They said the mortgage was just $500,000 a month, which seemed manageable for a house like that. That was what he actually said. I laughed when I heard it, a full belly laugh alone in my car. $500,000 a month? No wonder everything was crumbling. That night, while they sat in the dim light of a house they no longer understood, I snuck back in through the side gate and slipped inside while no one was watching. But not to help. I wasn't there to fix their mess. I came back to collect what was mine. And something else, too, something I hadn't even known I wanted until the door clicked shut behind me. I waited until the house had gone dark, not because I thought anyone would be home. Richard had taken Evan out to a steak place he probably couldn't afford anymore, and Carol had a book club she barely liked but never missed. But because I wanted that extra hour of silence, that moment when walls stopped listening and the floors stopped remembering who used to live there. I parked 2 blocks away, ducked through the side gate, and crept around back with the kind of careful muscle memory you develop when you've spent your whole life moving through a house without being noticed. The key was still hidden under the 3rd brick by the door, just like it had been for 20 years, because some habits die harder than people think. The air smelled like dry leaves and dust, and I had to steady my breath before I pushed the door open and slipped inside. It was strange, being back in the place I'd left behind so completely, like trying on a coat that no longer fits, but still carries your scent in the lining. The lights were off, but enough moonlight came through the windows to guide me down the hallway and into the office, the one Richard had always called his command center, even though he barely used the computer unless he was checking sports scores or yelling at Fox News. I wasn't there for nostalgia, and I sure as hell wasn't there to fix anything. I just needed the last box, the one with my old tax forms, a few journals, and some documents I didn't want to leave behind in a house where my name was now spoken like a curse. But when I opened the closet where the box was supposed to be, I saw something else. The old file cabinet with the silver handle that never quite closed all the way. It was the same one he used to keep locked, the one I wasn't allowed to touch, not even when I was managing payroll or reconciling vendor accounts. And that was when curiosity started to outweigh common sense. I tried the handle. Locked. I checked the drawers above it. Nothing. But when I tapped the left side panel, it gave just a little, enough to make me wonder. So I took out a letter opener from the desk drawer, slipped it into the crack like a pry bar, and jimmied it loose until the lock popped with a soft metallic sigh, like the cabinet itself was tired of keeping secrets. Inside, There were 3 leather-bound ledgers, yellowed at the corners, labeled in handwriting that wasn't mine or Evan's. Each book was thick with handwritten notes, codes, and numbers that didn't match anything I'd seen in our accounting system. There were also folders, sloppy, overstuffed, half-labeled, filled with tax filings that hadn't gone through official channels, falsified W-9s, and what looked like forged contractor signatures. And taped to the inside of one folder was a post-it note in Richard's handwriting that read, "Keep separate, don't let M. See." I don't know how long I stood there. My mouth had gone dry, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Page after page revealed the same thing: money being siphoned off, invoices paid to companies that didn't exist, contractor IDs that belonged to dead people or strangers, and underneath it all, my own name scribbled here and there. Initials used to approve transfers I didn't remember authorizing. That's when it hit me: he had used me, not just as a buffer between him and the world, but as a shield, a clean face on a dirty operation. I had unknowingly been part of the lie, signing off on deals I never saw, trusting that the system I helped build wasn't being corrupted behind my back. And Evan Lazy, entitled Evan, had been signing his name to paperwork like it was a joke, like none of it would ever come back to touch him, because why would it? He was the son, the heir, the chosen one. I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos, every page, every form, every scribbled note. I took videos, slow pans across the desk, focusing on dates and dollar amounts and names I recognized from staff meetings and vendor calls. When I was done, I sent the entire batch to my friend Danielle, who worked in corporate compliance at a firm in Chicago. I didn't explain anything. I just wrote, "Tell me what this looks like to you. Be honest." And that's when the house alarm went off. It wasn't the blaring kind, just a sharp, piercing chime that echoed through the walls, meant to scare off burglars or spook teenagers sneaking out. I froze, phone still in my hand, heart racing so fast I thought I might throw up. Footsteps came down the hallway a minute later, fast, uneven, familiar. It was Carol. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't scream. She just stood in the doorway like she'd known I would come back eventually, like maybe she'd hoped for it but didn't dare say so. Her eyes were tired but alert, her hair pulled back in a way that reminded me of the old her, the version of my mother before the fear took over, before she started folding towels just to avoid being yelled at. I ducked into the pantry, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath, trying to decide whether to run or explain or hide forever. She followed me in quietly, carefully, and stopped just a few feet from where I crouched beside the cereal boxes and canned tomatoes. Then she said something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "If I help you, will you help me?" We didn't say anything else that night. We didn't hug or cry or even look each other in the eye for more than a second. But she walked me to the back door, unlocked it with slow hands, and let me go without asking where I'd been or what I planned to do. And I think in that moment, we both knew something had shifted, not just in the family, but in ourselves. A thread had been pulled loose, and neither of us had any intention of sewing it back. The next time I touched that ledger, it wasn't to save them. It was to bury them. By the time winter rolled around, I was living in a second-floor apartment above a thrift store in a quiet part of town where nobody knew my name and, more importantly, nobody cared to ask. I'd taken a job at a local firm that specialized in tax consultation for small construction companies, nothing flashy, nothing permanent, but just enough to stay close to the kind of work I'd once mastered while quietly rearranging my life into something unrecognizable. I went by a different name there, just a slight variation, Margaret H., instead of Maggie Harrison, and it amazed me how little people question things as long as you showed up on time and didn't cause trouble. There was a kind of freedom in being nobody, in blending in with people who carried their own secrets, who didn't flinch when you said you didn't have family in the area. I spent my evenings filing paperwork and my nights building a storm. It started with a single envelope. No return address, just a typed note to the IRS, with enough documentation to raise suspicion. I didn't send everything at once. That would have been reckless, desperate, too loud. I fed them clues like breadcrumbs, each piece leading to another inconsistency in the books, another forged name on a fake contractor file, another check cashed through an account that didn't exist 2 years ago. And each time I sent something, I felt a little less guilty, a little more alive. I wasn't just getting back at them. I was taking back every minute they stole, every thankless task, every insult buried in a smile. The next move came through Evan's assistant, Lauren, a woman so used to being ignored that she barely blinked when I reached out through a fake profile and offered her a job with flexible hours and high pay if she'd agree to move a few invoices around each week. I didn't ask her to lie, not at first. I just had her resend existing documents with small errors I had engineered. Then I started inserting new vendors' names that sounded plausible, accounts that looked legitimate, but all of it was part of the slow drip I'd created to make the entire foundation rot from the inside out. Lauren never asked who I was. I think she knew better than to pry. People like her learn quickly where silence is safer than curiosity, and I rewarded her with regular deposits and compliments disguised as instructions. Meanwhile, the books back home started looking a little less stable every week. Uncle Donnie, who'd always been the family's drunken compass for truth no one wanted to face, started asking questions after his direct deposit bounced twice in 1 month. At first, they blamed the bank, then a software glitch, then Maggie's system, like I'd coded some kind of ghost into their operations that was now haunting them for fun. Donnie didn't buy it. He started hanging around the office more, opening drawers he wasn't supposed to, looking at Richard like maybe he was finally realizing that the empire his brother built was just drywall and duct tape, about to cave in with the next strong wind. Carol, meanwhile, had begun tucking money into strange places, inside books she never read, behind picture frames, under the floorboards of her closet. I knew because she'd told me, one late night on the phone when she whispered like someone might hear her, even though she was alone in the house. Just in case, she said, and I didn't ask what the case was. We both knew she was building her own escape plan, one folded bill at a time. The audit hit just after Valentine's Day, right around the time the water heater gave out and the city issued a warning about their unpaid property taxes. Richard tried to play it cool when the IRS showed up, but his face turned the kind of red that only comes from a mix of rage and fear, and Evan had the audacity to text me, asking if I'd heard about Dad's bad luck lately. I didn't respond. I just laughed and poured myself a drink. Their biggest client, Stonebridge Development, the one that kept their lights on for over a decade, pulled out the same week after receiving an anonymous letter detailing the false permit filings and the inflated invoices that Richard had insisted were industry standard. I didn't need to sign that letter for it to ruin him. The facts were enough. Still, I couldn't resist adding a little flair. I sent him flowers. Yellow lilies, the kind he used to say looked too feminine for a proper yard. With them came a note, typed on a vintage typewriter I bought from a pawn shop just for the occasion. It read, "Some things bloom better when you stop poisoning the soil." Carol told me he threw the whole bouquet into the garbage disposal and jammed it so badly the kitchen sink flooded the next day. She said he barely spoke for hours after that, just sat in his recliner drinking scotch at 2 in the afternoon, staring at the wall like it owed him something. Evan, on the other hand, went into damage control mode, calling lawyers, emailing banks, trying to bribe old clients with promises he couldn't keep. But none of it mattered. The hole I'd carved was slow and deep, and it wasn't done growing. I watched it all from a distance. I didn't gloat. I didn't dance around my apartment like a villain in a movie. I just smiled. A slow, quiet smile that felt like a breath I'd been holding in for 20 years. This wasn't about revenge, not really. This was about balance. About watching a crooked world tilt back towards something fair, even if only for a little while. And then, just when I thought the silence might stretch into something permanent, they called. One final dinner. No reason given. No details offered. Just an invitation, handwritten by Carol, sealed with wax like it was a wedding or a funeral. I stared at it for a long time before I answered. And I said yes. Exactly 1 year after I packed my bag and walked away from the house I once held together like a nervous heartbeat, I pulled into the driveway again, only this time the gravel didn't crunch beneath my tires the same way, and the air didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. I parked under the same sagging oak that had leaned over this house since I was 10, stepped out in a navy blue suit with sharp lapels and sharper heels, and didn't bother to look back at the car before I walked up the path. If they were expecting the girl who used to fold the laundry while listening to their silence for praise, they were going to choke on their roast beef. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. Still, I knocked once hard, loud, enough to remind them I didn't live here anymore and didn't need to. Carol opened it, wearing pearls she hadn't touched in years, the same sweater she used to save for funerals and anniversaries. She looked older in the face, but younger in the shoulders, like something had unspooled inside her over the last 12 months and finally let her breathe. Her smile was the kind you practice before a mirror and forget how to finish. I didn't hug her. Inside, the table was set like a picture from a magazine they couldn't afford anymore, complete with matching napkins and candlesticks from the attic that I swore had been packed away forever. Evan was already sitting at the end, drinking something from a glass he wasn't swirling with the same arrogance anymore. His suit didn't fit right, and the skin under his eyes looked like it had been trying to tell the truth for weeks now. He didn't speak. He just nodded once and looked away, like the floor was more trustworthy than I ever was. And then there was Richard. He stood as I entered, mostly out of habit than respect, his frame sunken into itself, shoulders drawn forward like gravity had finally decided to deal with him properly. He looked gaunt, as if the weight of every lie he'd ever polished finally started pressing down from the inside. His hair had gone almost white, and the whiskey in his hand trembled just slightly as he lifted it toward me without a word. He didn't apologize. He never would. But the room had changed, and so had I, and we both felt it like a shift in weather that couldn't be undone. Dinner was tight. The food was warm but forgettable, like no one really expected to enjoy the meal, just endure it. Small talk filled the space where confrontation used to live, Carol asking about how work's been, Evan mumbling something about a new startup that hadn't launched, and Richard chewing slow, like he was buying time with every bite. When the plates were cleared, he stood, barely, and raised his glass with a sigh that made even the silverware flinch. "To family," he said, voice low, rough, and resentful. "And the strength to get through whatever the hell this has been." No one clapped. No one drank. He sat down like the toast had sucked what little air he had left out of him. That was my cue. I stood, calm and tall, my hand sliding into the inside pocket of my blazer with the same precision I used to sign off payrolls. I looked each of them in the eye, Carol first, Evan second, and Richard last, and raised my glass halfway before speaking. "To families who don't know what they have until it leaves. To fathers who think silence is strength. And to daughters who turn ledgers into leverage." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, plain, beige, unmarked, but heavy in the way that only truth can be. I walked it across the table, set it down in front of Richard like an offering, and stepped back with both hands folded neatly in front of me. He didn't touch it at first. His eyes narrowed like he was trying to see through the cover before deciding whether or not to be afraid. Eventually, his fingers curled around the edge, and he opened it slowly, page by page, his mouth tightening as the contents registered. A full documentation trail of asset purchases, LLC agreements, stock transfers, and silent partner contracts. One by one, the pages made it clear, I now owned the land under the company office. I owned the name of the business, the insurance contracts, and the digital rights. The company, as he knew it, belonged to me. Evan leaned forward with the fury of someone who had always gotten everything without asking. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, voice cracking like he'd forgotten how to sound confident. "It's mine," I said, keeping my voice steady but cold. "All of it." bought out in pieces over the past 6 months. Through shell corporations, silent bids, and the very loopholes Richard taught me to fear. Carol said nothing. She just picked up her wine glass and sipped, eyes half-lidded like she was watching a fire burn down the house, but no longer cared about saving the drapes. Richard didn't speak until the last page, the one that confirmed I had closed on the office property under the name Marin Gray, the name I'd been using since the day I walked away. His lips parted, cracked and slow, and he muttered, "I always knew you'd destroy this family." "No," I said, straightening my jacket and placing my empty glass on the table. I just stopped holding it up. Silence fell like a dropped knife. Heavy, sharp, final. I turned and walked toward the door without being dismissed, without looking back, but the sound of heels behind me stopped me just outside on the porch. Carol had followed, her arms crossed tight against her chest, but her mouth didn't hold the tension it used to. "Now what?" I asked her, not because I needed an answer, but because I needed to know if she still believed one existed. She looked at me, then past me, toward the night sky that stretched far beyond the roof of the house that had raised and caged us both. "Now," she said softly, "you teach me how to do what you did." And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure who the teacher really was. We didn't go back inside. We didn't hug. We just stood there, two women once held hostage by the same man, breathing air we no longer had to earn. And behind us, inside that house, the silence grew deeper. But this time, it didn't belong to me.